Second year of a part-time PhD at the University of Sussex. This is the title of my research project. And this morning, I just wanted to talk to you briefly to outline my research project, to give you some idea of why I'm doing it, and then in particular to talk a little bit about methodology, because the part of work that I'm embarking on just now involves using a type of research which is really taking me out of my comfort zone as an art historian, because it involves using some computer mapping software. So it's a practical application of what we're learning now to call the digital humanities. And as I say, it's quite a new sort of research for me. So to just introduce you to my research, I use this lovely map. It's one of my favourites because in 1794 they helpfully called it the middle part of Italy, just to locate you as to where my research is based. This one, I think, perhaps gives you a slightly better idea. And if I just point out that Rome is down here, Perugia, where a lot of my research is based, is just around here, just to give you an idea of where we are. One of my main research aims is to trace the networks of patrons and the way that ideas about images and artists spread in this small geographical area. But why am I doing it? So what? Why study patronage in Umbria at this time? Well, a conference in 1987 on patronage, art and society in Renaissance Italy noted that the abundance of archive material in Florence has led to what they described as Florentinitis. In other words, a complete concentration in secondary works on Florence at the expense of all other areas. And in the 2 decades following that, not much changed. Let's face it, when we think about the Italian Renaissance, we tend to think about Florence. But a lot of research is happening in Umbria now. New documents are regularly being brought to light from the archives of Umbrian towns, shedding new light on the whole business of art in the area. And it is clear that between 1480 and 1510, when I've set the parameters of my research, the churches of northern Umbria underwent a period of huge renovation and adornment, and the extent of works commissioned simultaneously within the area means that work on patronage has the potential to deepen our understanding of the operation of patronage as a social practice. So that's what I think makes this a good period and place to locate the study. And why patronage? Well, I would contend that a study of art without an understanding of why it was made, why it exists at all, is an incomplete study. And Michael Baxendale's much quoted opening comment to his painting and experience in 15th century Italy puts that much more succinctly than I can. A 15th century painting is the deposit of a social relationship. And he went on to clarify both parties, by which he was referring to patron and artist, worked within institutions and conventions, commercial, religious, perceptual, in the widest sense social, that were different from ours and influenced the forms of what they together made. And the phrase that's key for me here is that what they together made. The production of art in 15th century Italy was a joint enterprise of patron and artist, and it was seen by such as contemporaries. There are numerous works of art in the period which name the patron as the person who made the work rather than the artist. So I hope that gives you some idea why patronage and why in Umbria at the close of the 15th century. But how best to undertake the study? Well, what we know of the practice of patronage is really what has determined the way that I'm studying, and I'll try and outline that now. Recent scholastic work has made it clear that patrons at this time were largely motivated in their commissioning of artists by their desire to forge and to sustain links to bolster their own social and economic prospects. So the patrons were networking, but the artists were too. These were, after all, jobbing painters in a competitive market, and there is much evidence to suggest that they too relied on building up networks of patrons and allies as they tried to maintain their own livelihoods. To illustrate what I mean by this, I'm going to give you one example of mine from a small town some 50 kilometres north of Perugia called Città di Castello, where both the choice of location and the choice of artist very clearly indicate that the main concern of the patron was this sort of networking, and where the artist achieved the commission through his connections. And by showing this, I want to demonstrate why building up a database of information on patron and on artist can afford a new understanding of artistic commissions and patronage. So I'll just move on to that example now and hopefully guide you through it. In November of 1505, a contract was signed commissioning an artist called Francesco Tifanate to make an altarpiece for the chapel of Ludovica Magalotti, a widow, in the church of San Domenico in Città di Castello. The contract stated that the panel must be the same size, display the same quantity of gold paint as an altarpiece already in the same church in the chapel of Domenico Gavari. What Ludovica Magalotti got was this Annunciation panel. The altarpiece in Gavari's chapel, which is mentioned in the contract, is this one. And although art historians today shy away from making value judgments, I think we can say there's a marked difference in quality. And I would venture to say that the Tifanati is perhaps mediocre. And this is relevant to our understanding because, as I shall conclude, the patron had other things in mind than purely aesthetic concerns. We know that when contracts like this made reference to another work to be used as a model, they required not a copy, but to make a conscious link with the patron of that work. Now, it's particularly interesting that this model clause should have been included, because in fact we know that the stone frame for Ludovica's altarpiece was in place in the church at least a year before the contract was made. So both the shape and the size of the altarpiece must in fact already have been decided. There was no need for her to say she wanted it to be the same size as Gavari's. I conclude that the clause was included entirely for Ludovica to make that link with Gavari, the other patron, rather than for any aesthetic purpose. And as was common practice at the time, the frame of the Mond crucifixion, this one here, was inscribed Hoc opus fieri fecit Domenicus Gavaris. This work was made by Domenico Gavari. So his name was literally all over it. You were going to know who the patron was. And if we take a look at the locations of these paintings, it will underline this. This is taken at the original entrance point to the church of San Domenico, and the Mond crucifixion would have been here. You can just about see the frame still extant. Magalotti's altarpiece, I believe, stood here, although we no longer have the frame. When you walked into that church, you would have been able to see both of those, and it very clearly makes visual the link that the contract put into writing. Now, what we know is that Gavari, have I already said this? Gavari was part of a circle of men who regularly stood on the Concilio, the body which governed the town, and the Magalottis moved in similar circles, but were less prominent. So seeking to align themselves with a more prominent family would have made sense. And the contract stated this, and here we see it in place. So that's the visual link, the practical link. What of Ludovica Magalotti's choice of artist? Well, that too, I contend, was defined by her intention to use this commission to cement her social position. Tifanati was the son of a man called Battista di Florido, a goldsmith whose business dealings brought him into regular contact with the Magalottis. He also stood on the Concilio and was part of that same elite governing circle as Gavari. He would have been in an excellent position to exercise a little nepotism on the part of his artist son, and the widow, Ludovica, could select him to execute her work, safe in the knowledge that her choice would have been approved of by the local great and the good. So I hope that's given some sense of why uncovering the biographies of the people who made the altarpiece between them, and by comprehending its original setting, it becomes clear that this commission was defined by the networking of both patron and painter, or in this case, his father. And it's these sorts of links that my research is seeking to uncover. To identify and to trace these networks, it's necessary to identify the constituent parts and personalities of the process of commissioning and of making the paintings, and then to record them in a way that I can use them. So while tracing the network surrounding this commission in the small town in Città di Castello is not too hard to do, when I start to look at Perugia, the sheer quantity of artists, of patrons, and of public spaces where paintings were displayed makes for a huge quantity of data. There were large numbers of works commissioned in this period, and dozens of artists are recorded as working in the city. You wouldn't have been able to find much space for quiet contemplation in the churches in Perugia at that time. They must have been filled with the sounds of frames being hammered into place, of artists yelling at their workshop boys, and the rustle of pen on parchment as notaries recorded the agreements between artist and patron. And there are numerous variables as well to record for each painting and for each patron. And I won't show you one of my very boring spreadsheets, but I will just give you a sense of some of the variables that I pick out in order to try and make links from the information. And this, I think, makes clear that you would have a contract for the painting as well as for the frame separately, and there are a huge number of people involved in putting together one of these works. So if I was going to analyse by painting, I would have a list like this with probably another 10 different variables. I can consider by patron, and I would want to then understand which parish they came from, their official posts, which notaries they employed, because that can indicate the circles that people moved in and their confraternity membership. So once upon a time, we would just have made a big list of all those things. I use an Excel spreadsheet with a line for each painting and columns for all the variables, because it means that I can then sort and resort the data as often as I want to show me, for example, all the Perugino paintings that might have been on display in Perugia at a certain date line, or all the paintings for whom the notary was, for example, Paolo Pacisordi, or the ones for whom the frame maker was the same, or for whom the patrons belonged to a particular confraternity or parish. So those confluences then become much more easily identifiable. And what I'm currently working on is using a mapping application which can add a geographical dimension to this. I've just included this slide to just show you in a very basic way that it plots we can plot the position of where a painting was and use a pop-up which can record, there's only a few pieces of information there, but you can record as much as you like and see that quite easily. And I can then, for example, consider at a certain date line which were the paintings with a particular subject matter that were on public view in the city. Or, for example, this one, to start to consider some of the many works by Perugino that could have been seen by a visitor to Perugia at 1500. And as I hope I've shown with my example of San Domenico earlier, it is crucial to understanding later commissions to understand what was already there, so what the patrons were looking at when they visited. And making these sorts of connections would have been much more difficult using just traditional strategies. So to conclude, patterns of patronage in Renaissance Perugia. I hope I've given you some sense of what my research is about, of why I'm doing it, and a little bit about the methodology which I'm using and starting to use, as with the mapping technology, to try and get as much as I can out of my research. As I said, it's great to have days like today when we can start to engage with other researchers on our work. Part of my motivation in speaking today was to open the possibility of discussion on the ways in which people are using digital methods to record and to sort data. We all have very different projects, but some of these things we have in common. So if anyone's interested in that and is doing any kind of a similar sorts of research, maybe has some fantastic software that I'd love to know about, please do get in touch. Thank you.